This is the first in a series of lectures, class on capitalism and social democracy. I think it's important to begin by defining some of the terms we'll be working with so that people have a clearer understanding of exactly what we mean by each of the terms. We talk about capitalism, we talk about socialism, communism, social democracy. All of these, in many people's minds, if not interchangeable, are certainly usually somewhat confused. So in order to have some clarity, let me just divide things into two basic and fundamental sort of structures, which then we'll dismiss because you'll see why they don't necessarily work nice and neatly. We think of economic systems as a certain type of system, and then think of governing systems as another type. So oftentimes, if we're talking about an economic system, we might say capitalism, let's say. If we're talking about a political structure or governing structure, we might talk about democracy. So part of the problem here is that these terms are not clearly defined. In some cases, we bring the terms together from economics and from governance and form a different term completely. And these things are not static. Add to that people have preconceived ideas going in about what socialism is, communism is, and oftentimes people have a very visceral sort of reaction to what those things are. In their minds, they mean something very specific, whether or not their perception or understanding is correct. So I want to make sure that we at least have some fundamental grounding in what these terms mean. Now, in order to define them and move on to the larger context that we're going to place them in, it's important to say up front that by defining things as complicated as capitalism and socialism and the like, requires that if we're going to do it in a reasonable time so that we can move on with other things, as I've said, you have to make certain concessions. In other words, we're not going to be doing a 5-hour, intensive look at capitalism. We're going to look at it, and we're going to look at it, in detail. But when it comes to defining it, we're just going to go ahead and give some, I think, definitions that will clear things up for people, basically in their own minds about what we're talking about. And then I'll make some comparisons between some of these, terms, so that hopefully that will help make it even clearer. And then we'll talk about some of these terms in conjunction, one with the other, so that once again we understand the interrelationships here. So one thing before we start with that, it's important to also keep in mind that this class is not about advocating any one particular system, economic, governing, or otherwise. It's really about looking at the two important structures and trying to understand what works and what doesn't work, why it works or why it doesn't work, so that we can then make a comparison that's informed and have some sense of what might work in one system and not in another. So the point of the class is really to look at capitalism, its pluses and minuses. What works, what doesn't work, what's problematic. Okay, how people perceive those things, and on the other hand, to also look at socialism and social democracy, and to what benefit there is there, and what kinds of issues we have to deal with. So, up first is we're going to go ahead and we're going to define some of these terms. So that we can have a better understanding of exactly what we mean when we're discussing these, so that for you as students as well, you'll be better informed when you hear these terms, and also probably become very aware that people often use them incorrectly or interchange them in a way that is not correct. So let's just start off with socialism. Okay, socialism really is a system of social organization, right? And here it is about producing the means of production, distributing goods, who owns those goods. In socialism, it's owned collectively, right? Or by some sort of centralized government that represents the people, and that government plans and controls the economy. If you want to make a comparison that in America here, we do have certain elements of this, right? In terms of tax law, let's say. There's also social programs. You know, there's all kinds of laws and programs that really fit into sort of a socialism sort of ideology. So nothing is pure here. You know, a pure capitalist system, pure democracy, pure communist system. These things don't really exist. So when we talk about socialism, basically we're talking about a form of social organization, right? Uh, and we're talking about the means of producing things, the distributing of those goods, who owns them, in this case collectively by a centralized government, and then that government usually plans and controls the economy. Now, I understand when we talk about socialism and communism, people right away go to, Marx, they go right away to, the former Soviet Union, Russia, China. I'd like to keep those all out of play here. I don't think we need to bring in our own perceptions of what those places or what the historical involvement of those places in our own lives has been. I think it's important to just keep the definitions as pristine as possible so we have some clarity. So socialism then is that system of social organization and has that economic component to it. When we talk about social democracy, here we have the system that advocates the use of democratic means, right? That is trying to make or achieve a gradual transition from capitalism to socialism. Because what this really comes down to is we're going to have economic development. There's always going to be an economy. There's always going to be the need for governance. What do we believe is the best form or combination of those things? And oftentimes, that's difficult to arrive at because we don't all come from the same place with it. That's to say, depending upon my path to the present or how I perceive things, I might believe that one system or one structure is better than another. Yes, so you really can't get agreement on some rational basis. In other words, this is not scientific by nature. You can't run an experiment and prove that it works or it doesn't work. So we do have very broad and often difficult to structure views of things, about what works and what doesn't work. So in America, for example, in a capitalist society, we believe that the individual, so long as they have opportunity, that's really the most important aspect, the most important thing. Somewhere else, it could be some other yardstick. So the yardsticks change. So in a social democracy, we're talking about this gradual transition from capitalism to socialism. So let's just talk about capitalism for a second. Capitalism is really an economic system, right? And here again, it's the means of production and distribution. And those things are privately owned, usually by corporations. And the accumulation of profits and reinvestment go to those folks. And there is what we call a free market, where the market is supposed to really dictate exactly price and quantity and all of that. So in a capitalist society, it's an economic system. It's about capital. And we'll go into that in great detail because obviously that's a connection that we're examining in the course. Communism gets a little bit more, I think, difficult for people because really it's another economic system, and it's characterized by collective ownership of property and the organization of labor. And the idea here is that you organize that labor for what is best for all members. Now, you have to understand that the idea and the way in which that idea eventually manifests itself, in other words, how it comes to realization, could be very different. Often when we take things that are theoretical and we put them into a practical structure, they often change. And not oftentimes in a discernible way. And certainly they don't change in a way that remains. In other words, there's no transition to some point, and that's where it remains. There's constant evolution of these ideas. But communism, I think this is what makes it difficult for people as well, is also a system of governance, right? And here again, the plan is that the state will control the economy, and that there'll be typically, often is, authoritarian sort of party that rules everything, that holds power. And their goal, or what they profess, is that they're trying to move the society toward a social order, where goods are distributed equally and shared by all people. And then also associated with communism is the Marxist-Leninist version of communist doctrine. And basically there it's a little bit more radical. It's the overthrow of capitalism, through revolution by the proletariat. So what we're interested in looking at here is the differences, to some extent, between capitalism and social democracy. Keep in mind that democracy and capitalism in America are hand in hand. We believe ourselves to be a democracy and a capitalist democracy at that. So if you just look at a simple definition of democracy, it's a government made by the people. Okay, it's a government made by the people. Capitalism, right, is basically about the means of production and private ownership. Okay, which we'll go into. Again, democracy is all about the public sector, and capitalism is really about the private sector, right? Democracy, when you talk about growth, it's basically public and government combined growth that we're talking about in democracy. It's not just government growth or private sector. When we're talking about capitalism, it's individual growth. It's the benefit to the benefit of the individual, right? Now, in a democracy, when it comes to classes, there's supposed to be no divide, and if there is a divide, it's into two classes, right? And with capitalism, basically the society gets divided into the rich and the poor. In other words, we tend to think about, when we think about classes, we think about those that have and those that don't have. Generally in society, when we think about democracy, society is supposed to come before the individual. Obviously, in capitalism, individual freedom takes a front and center place, above the society, right? So basically, where society is concerned, society comes before the individual, right, in democracy, and the individual comes before society in capitalism. So far as capital is concerned, under democracy, it's supposed to benefit both the society and the public, whereas capital is supposed to benefit only the owner under capitalism. And obviously, economic growth, under democracy, there's concern that there'd be a growth of the state, and under capitalism, there is no economic growth for the state. That's not an issue. Since the class focuses on capitalism and social democracy, we're going to spend, obviously, a great deal of time looking at capitalism and social democracy. So let's put a little bit more meat on the bones where capitalism is concerned. As I said before, it's an economic system, right? And it's a system where the resources are privately owned. Okay, so the goods and services that are produced in a capitalist economy are produced for profit in a market economy. So in a capitalist society, the parties which make the transition nominally, right, decide the prices at which the goods, services are going to be exchanged, supply and demand. The fundamentals, of course, include the idea of capital and capital growth. That also takes into account, the competitive markets, and obviously the cost of labor. So in a capitalist structure, you've got, in a very, real sense, you've got people coming to the open market in an exchange, and if done the way, we fashion this happening in a capitalist structure, The market's open, it's free, people negotiating quantity and price, and the market is self-regulating. So basically, when you think about it in those terms, it seems like it would work pretty straightforwardly, right? People negotiate, there's a price. Of course, this happens not on an individual basis, but in a much larger sort of context. So basically, the key element here is that it's characterized by profit and also by private or corporate ownership. And obviously, the investments are private decisions about where people want to invest their money and so on and so forth. So the production and the distribution of goods in a capitalist structure are mainly really supposed to be determined by the competition, right, in the free marketplace. So we're not going to talk about monopolies or the like. We're not going to talk about ways in which that market can be controlled or distorted. In a very pure sense, up front, we're just simply saying there's competition in the free market, and that competition is what stabilizes that market and keeps it open for all. Okay, so capitalism, oftentimes is looked at by some as a system that is not fair, however we want to define that word, is not fair to all people. We can see that there's a great disparity even in America, obviously, between the rich and the, I don't want to say poor because that's not necessarily the case, between the rich and the non-rich, which extends through a middle class all the way down to the poor. So keep in mind that what we have in a capitalist structure is we have capital, which we'll go more into. We have private ownership, right? We have the generation of wealth for the individual. Okay, so that's what capitalism is structured around and focused on. Okay, what I want to do now is talk about democracy, just to put this in a context, and I'll bring the two together, capitalism and democracy. All right, so democracy is a form of government, right? That I said before, made by the people. It really is supposed to mean the rule of the majority, right? That's what a democracy is in its operational, in an operational sense. In a pure definitional sense, you're not going to be able to have a true democracy where everyone is involved in every decision being made. So really what you have is you have representative democracies. But we'll consider those representative democracies to conform to the definition of a democracy. So you may or may not know this, but in a democracy, people choose their own representatives to run for government. They cast votes, as we know. All citizens are considered equal. Now, let me just say this. In a democracy, it doesn't mean that everyone is considered equal in all ways. It means that in terms of their interaction with the government, they are to be treated equally. So we all have one vote, for example. It doesn't mean, democracy does not mean that all citizens will have exactly the same economic benefits that come out of whatever the economic system is. It just simply means that everyone has an equality. There's an equality around their role in the government. Okay? So when we talk about the government then interacting with the people and the markets, that anything the government or the state does in terms of those two things is shared by all the people. In other words, we all own whatever the government does in terms of if the government were to get involved somewhere and make some sort of a profit, or if the government were to spend money. This is our money they're spending, right? This is belongs to all of us. Okay, so basically, when you have a government that is a democracy, you have the people ultimately being the wellspring of all power and authority, and the government represents the people based on what the people want, and what the people want is determine what happens pretty much in the political arena, especially around elections. So when we talk about democracy, we're talking about the people having a direct, and we can debate all of this. This is not what I'm interested in doing at this point, but people having a direct say in the political leadership of the country and the policies, the political policies that are developed by those that are in positions in the government, that the people are ultimately in control. One thing we should keep in mind throughout here is that the job of government is really to decide who gets what, under whatever form or whatever form it may take. Ultimately, government decides who gets what. And that's a very important function of what a government does. So there's really no escaping the importance of government structure. So when we think about economics and we think about governance, they are intertwined. And that's part of the problem. So people often have difficulty looking at extracting the economic system, looking at it separately, seeing what works, what doesn't work, how it even works, and the governing structure and how that works or doesn't work. And then, of course, we have to put the two together. Economic activity doesn't happen in a vacuum, so it is subject to the governing structures. And governing structures don't happen in a vacuum. They are also a consequence of and driven by what's going on economically. Throw into the mix now the fundamentals of human nature, which we are not going to touch on at all because that's not what the class is about, and you begin to see how complex this can become. So what are we really going to focus on here? What's our interest? Our interest is in looking at capitalism. And that means it's going to bleed into governance and all of that, but look at capitalism. And we're going to look at social democracy. And we're going to look at fundamentally what they are, what their strengths and weaknesses are from a number of different perspectives, and not walk away. The goal here is not to make a determination about one or the other, but to get an understanding in the limitations of each and the value of each, and making a determination, if any at all, about what makes sense in our own lives, because that's all we can do, in terms of what kind of a structure we think would be best for us individually. And then we can have a conversation about what would be best collectively. I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that we're not trying, again, to come to a final decision, a moment where we say, there it is, capitalist structures work. That's not what we're going to be able to do, but you're going to be informed about the shortcomings of capitalism and its strengths and social democracy. Okay, having said all of that, if it appears that just by the videos I'm having you watch, the 17 contradictions or the 23 things they didn't tell you about capitalism, it almost looks as if I already have a particular point of view here. And the fact is I don't. That's for you to decide on your own. But my assumption here is that if you're taking this class, you're probably American, or if not, you are certainly have been part of a capitalist system. So you probably already have a certain amount of affinity for or a certain mindset around capitalism. And so what I'm trying to do is shake that a bit, so that maybe you can distance yourself a little from it. And that means to sort of take capitalism and, I don't want to say sully it a bit, but certainly let you begin to understand that there are shortcomings here and there are problems with it, and open up your mind to then considering alternatives, one of which is social democracy. By the time we get our minds around capitalism and we've sort of structured that, you'll be in a much better position to look at social democracy and come to terms with, what its strengths are and its weaknesses are. So on the upside here, we don't have to really look at every aspect of each, capitalism and social democracy. And looking at capitalism it will allow us to, at least in some ways, prioritize what's important and what's not. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off, because I think the two most important, videos in terms of what we're trying to get at, deal with those two topics. The 17 contradictions and the 23 things they never told you. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the Stiglitz video, and there are a couple of important things I want to extract from that. First of all, he comes up with off the cuff, but I think a very good way at looking at economic systems. What he basically says is that in the context of capitalism, he says capitalism is failing, but then he defines what he means by that. And he said his statement really is that any economic system that doesn't deliver for very large groups of the population, doesn't deliver for the majority of its citizens, has got to be considered an economic system that's failing. So I think that's a pretty good yardstick, that if people come together to form societies, and they do, that's what we do, it seems to be in our DNA. If we're going to form societies, I think it's reasonable to say that no one forms a society or becomes part of that society to end up in a worse position physically, mentally, economically, than they would otherwise have been. In other words, we form governments and economic systems because we believe they benefit us somehow. And when it comes to economic systems, it's pretty clear that the way in which we assess those is whether they benefit us economically. So I think Stiglitz is onto something here, right? That if you look at the system that is a capitalist system, and it's really not producing for the majority of people, then it's a system in failure. But that could be said of any economic system, because we structure them, we become part of those systems because we believe they will benefit us. No one goes around shopping for that system that's going to oppress them or make their lives miserable. So it's a very good standard yardstick for measuring how effective an economy is. Now, that being said, how do we measure it? How do we measure what most people are getting or not getting, and whether it's serving the majority and how it's serving the majority of people? That becomes very difficult to define. But I think the way we normally do that is we sort of look at the equality or inequality of the distribution of wealth. That seems to be a pretty good yardstick. Of course, it means you have to define what wealth is, and there's not, contrary to what you may believe, there's not necessarily agreement on what economic wealth or what constitutes economic wealth. But nevertheless, for most people, the way it's measured is, what did I make last year, and what can I buy with what I made last year? So, as an example of this, one of the things that is done is we try and figure out what purchasing power is, yes? We want to know how much our money will buy. And so to know how we're doing, the best way to know if, our lot in life is improving is to look at how much stuff our money that we make will buy. If it buys a lot more than it did last year, the same amount, hey, we're doing better because we can buy more stuff. It doesn't matter what that stuff is. It could be, meditation classes, or it could be a Learjet. It doesn't matter. There's more stuff to buy. So what we do here, right, is we say, okay, well, how can we measure this? So there's a thing called a basket of goods. And basically, what goes into that basket of goods, and it's really not a basket, obviously, but, what goes into it are, things that people purchase. Everything from washing machines to hamburgers, let's say. So what we want to do is we want to see how much does it take to buy that basket of goods. And so let's say it takes X amount of dollars to buy that basket of goods. Now, 30 years go by, and how do we know if our lives are better now than they were, say, 30 years ago? Well, one thing we can do is we can see how much our money will buy. And so what we do is we look at that basket of goods, and we say, okay, my grandparents bought that basket of goods for X amount of dollars. That was their salary, and they bought that basket of goods. Today, I make nominally a lot more than my grandparents, right? They were making, say $1,000 a year. And now I'm making $30,000. So one would imagine I could buy 30 times that basket, or I could buy 30 of those baskets, let's say. But in fact, it turns out I can't even buy one basket with the 30-fold increase in income. Well, that really means your income has not gone up from your grandparents. In fact, you may have lost a little ground because your grandparents could buy the basket, and now even though you make 30 times more money, you can't buy that same basket. Not fully. There's some items you have to take out. What this indicates is that inflation, the natural sort of inflation that occurs, has really eaten up your income. So you're not doing better than your grandparents. Now, that being said, we join economic systems and governing systems to do better, not to do worse. And that's Stiglitz's point, that if you look at it, people are not doing as well as their grandparents did, right? And that in fact, even today, probably the best indicator of how someone's going to do is really how well their parents have done in terms of education and in terms of, financially. That seems to be a much more accurate indicator than how much education and opportunity and the like that the son or daughter might have. So what we look at here at Stiglitz is, okay, so how do we measure this? Well, we look at it and we say, okay, well, what are people making now? And if we adjust that for inflation, what are they really making? And when you do that, it turns out that really, even though productivity, right, in the last 100 years has had a 100% increase, productivity is way up, right? And part of that obviously is the technology and all of that, but it's gone way up. So we're producing more than we've ever produced before, and yet the incomes that people are making, right, there's been no increase over the last 25 years. And if you look at the actual wage rate, over the last 40 years, it's actually gone down by some 7%. So we're producing more, right, but we're making less. And so we can purchase less. So it's like being more productive, working for somebody, let's say your employer, and they say, thanks for being productive, but now we're going to take 7% of your salary away. Nobody would want to work under those conditions. And from Stiglitz's point of view, and quite honestly, my own and others, right, that's problematic. That's a system, whatever it may be, capitalism or not, that's not functioning very well. So the inequality in income, right, is problematic. So in America, we do something that's kind of interesting. We don't really talk about the inequality of income or the inequality of outcome. What I mean by that is we don't talk about the distribution of wealth or what it produces. In America, we seem to be focused on the equality of opportunity. Because in America, we believe, right, that if you work hard, you could be anyone you want to be, that sort of thing. So, did you have equal opportunity? If you have an opportunity, then that's all the society is responsible for. If that opportunity doesn't pan out and you don't turn it into something that makes you financially better off, well, that's really on you. And obviously, that's problematic because if you take that idea and you move it forward, that means that anyone that wishes to do well, all they need to do is just be given the opportunity, and then they will do well. Well, that's just not on so many practical levels even plausible, right? So, and if you look at America, the Gini index, the GINI index, which measures income inequality in nations, America has got a pretty wide gap. So you wouldn't think that about a developed society, especially with an old and advancing economy, that you would have such a gap. But I think we've all become painfully aware of the fact that in the last the last 40 years, the money has moved up to fewer and fewer. And those that are in the middle and at the bottom are not doing anywhere near as well as their grandparents were doing. So the system does seem to be in failure. And the question is then, well, what about the political structure? If the economics are not working out for us, is there some political rationale? Is there some political explanation? Is there something about democracy that creates problems for capitalism or vice versa? In other words, we have to look at the relationship between democracy and capitalism. So when we're going to compare capitalism to social democracy, we have to really look at democracy and capitalism, how they work, in order to be able to make the comparison between capitalism and social democracy. So when we look at democracy fundamentally, remember the people sort of make the final choice. The people sort of are running through representatives, the government, and all of that. And democracy allows the individual to prosper as they will. The government doesn't intervene, mostly, and but obviously there's intervention. We can't just have a completely open market where it's just dog eat dog. We do need to have structures, laws, and the like. It's not it can't be unstructured. But nevertheless, democracy at its core allows the individual to focus on the individual's well-being as part of a society. So those freedoms lend themselves to a capitalist structure where the goal is private ownership of of means of production and the like, private property. So one would imagine those two things go together, but there's also a downside to that particular marriage, democracy and capitalism, and that is it leaves open the possibility that the governing structure can be manipulated by the economic structure through economic elites. And we're not going to get into that just yet. What I really want to focus on now is basically the idea of social democracy, and I want to compare it to socialism so that we break that connection. I think people hear, socialism, they think communism, they think all kinds of things. Let's just separate it. Socialism and social democracy are not the same thing. Okay, so I think for most Americans that we only think in terms of political or economic dimensions. America seems to be very binary politically. And what I mean by that is we tend to think Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, left, right, capitalist, socialist, big government, small government. We tend to see things being broken down to two camps on a very consistent basis. So it's no surprise then for Americans when you say socialism, they automatically think it's the opposite of capitalism, let's say. And they think, therefore, it must be communism. And then these terms, as I said up top, become very confused. So basically, since Americans already have this built-in, what I call, binary, issue, then we have to kind of break that because it's the topic we're embarking on and we're looking at and we're, taking part in understanding is more complicated than that. So politically, things are much more nuanced than that little nice black and white binary sort of structure that most Americans seem to like. I don't know why that is, but it seems that we embrace that. Obviously, the most obvious example of that, I think, is political parties. We don't like third parties, which is kind of interesting. Whereas in other countries they do, we sort of fall into the camp of Democrats or Republicans, and even those that say they're independent, when you look at their voting and record and the like, they tend not to be so independent. They tend to be heavily leaning towards Democrat, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. And Americans just seem to be less willing to consider or be respectful of other possible possibilities in terms of structures and the like. So basically, that really becomes problematic because we don't leave ourselves open to examine alternative, possibilities. So that means we're stuck in the same old paradigm trying to solve every problem within that structure, even those problems which can't be solved within that structure. Nevertheless, we believe we can resolve them. So basically, in America, if someone even mentions the word socialism or socialist in any way, it becomes this, this weight around your neck. You can't seem to shake it. People then want to consider you that, even though they don't know what that exactly is. So these perspectives are there. It's very hard to change, and so I'm hoping that those that are taking the class are open to moving those biases aside for a second. And as I said, not so that you could be won over by socialism, but so you can understand it and then make an informed decision about what works and what doesn't work in each of the systems we're exploring. That's totally up to you. It's not for me to convince you that one or another way of doing this makes the most sense. All right, so if you look at socialism and social democracy, because we need to clear this up, right? One is really about the collective ownership of the means of production, right? Owning how things get produced, right? Goods, services, that sort of thing. The other you could say is about you know private ownership of production, right? But really about doing that around social solidarity. And what I mean by that is not just looking at individuals, right? Or the entirety, the governing structure controlling everything, but that we have to have some consideration for, our economic endeavors are placed into a much larger framework, and therefore what we do does influence and have an impact on others. So socialism tends to be more restrictive, right? And social democracy tends to be, sort of more libertarian. In other words, what I'm saying here is that socialism does carry with it, um, a sort of a responsibility, a control of the responsibility to be part of the whole. Whereas, social democracy really requires that we understand that we have choice, but that those choices should be informed by what's best for all of us in the collective. So no one individual should only consider what's to their, what's in their best interest, but must be willing to yield some of that because it serves the greater good. All right. Another is that one tends to be sort of very abstract, right? It's very difficult to sort of get your mind around what it does or doesn't do, and that socialism tends to fall into that category, whereas social democracy tends to be more empirical in nature. Verifiable reasoning about, okay, this makes sense to do because it's best for the system and for the individuals in it. Socialism, very dogmatic. Social democracy tends to be, I wouldn't say scientific, but certainly is not beholden to any particular, philosophy or structure. It thinks in terms of, we are part of a larger group, and that we should do what's best for everyone because in the long run, that's best for each of us. It doesn't mean that anyone's giving up their freedoms. It means those freedoms might be modulated in such a way that it does the greatest good for the most. Now, whereas capitalism believes that automatically springs from the open market, that open market operations automatically create, through self-adjustment, what's best for everyone. So if you look at it from a Friedman point of view, you just let the market do what it's going to do and get the government out of the way, and everything will be fine. Keynes was more, you have to know the government has a role to play here, and we need to be involved, the government does, in certain economic decisions in the marketplace. And somewhere between those two schools, you have people bouncing back and forth. Again, Americans like, dualities. They like it, to be binary in nature. Socialism tends to carry with it, a belief structure that is truly a belief structure. It's what people sort of define themselves as, where a social democracy requires that whatever decisions are made and however those decisions are made, that should be well considered. Okay. In other words, there's no specific way in which through which everything gets filtered. Okay, I want to turn our attention now to the 17 contradictions of capitalism, and that means I first have to deal with the use value versus the exchange value. When we're looking at the use value of something, right, we're looking at its usefulness, right? What that means is basically its value, the value to the individual. Material uses, what the person benefits by actually having it, what human need it fulfills. So the value of something is tied to its use. Okay. Whereas when we talk about exchange value, it's a different sort of setup here. In an exchange value, which by the way, that dominates in the world. All right, two commodities, two things can be exchanged, but there's an intervening element here, a third element, which is, the kind of the universal equivalent. In other words, money. Money is the thing about money is that it has no other purpose other than to allow for this exchange, right? So the value is in the money and the exchange. That's how we value something. Something's worth $10,000. Well, that's $10,000, and that's the value of that exchange. Whereas with use value, it's what purpose it serves, what human need is being fulfilled. That's what gives something its value. And that's what we're concerned with here when he talks about the 17 contradictions of capitalism. The exchange value, then, right, has to always be distinguished from use value. The exchange relation, right, of commodities is characterized precisely, this is Marx, by its abstraction from their use values. So money takes the form of the equivalence, right? But money actually hides the real equivalent, the real value, which is the labor that went into making that thing or providing that service. So really exchange value really conceals what really is the true value of something, which is the labor that went into it. That's a way in which we can describe the value of something. So in the 17 contradictions of capitalism, there's a decided sort of Marxist approach where basically the argument's being made, here are the weaknesses inherent in the capitalist system. And those weaknesses are about, we focus on those weaknesses because those weaknesses can cause damage or harm, not because on some ideological level they're problematic. But like with any system, we're looking to see exactly what particulars, events, what are the weaknesses in the system, what are its strengths, so we can understand the system. Again, this class is not about throwing capitalism out the window or and espousing some sort of Marxist view of things, but rather looking at those things as ideas and theories and getting a sense of why things work, why they don't work. So in the 17 contradictions of capitalism, the first thing that has to be worked out is an understanding around this use value and exchange value. That's one of the first that's the first contradiction that's being dealt with here. So basically, what if you've watched the video, what is laid out for you is this idea of how money comes about and how the exchange value. Right, so the exchange value needs some sort of a measure, right? How do you measure the exchange? We know this is going to end up with money. Nevertheless, so in the beginning, it was based on precious metals, right? Gold, silver, that sort of thing. But obviously, this limited, economies because the circulation based on that, was obviously not what it could have been, right? So it made sense on some level to move to, money, fiat money, right? Some sort of paper exchange that basically then gave some value. And the problem there, of course, is that the value should have really been based upon the social relation, right? The value that's been put in based on labor and the like, the social relation. But once money comes in, that no longer is considered. So first and foremost, you have to get your mind around use value and exchange value, right? In terms of which understanding the structure of each, right? So should we be considering in terms of what makes the most sense in some sort of economic structure, that we should build around this use value. What benefit, what value do people gain from the good or service, or the exchange value, some dollar amount that we can place on it. Now, the exchange value is a lot easier to work with, right? Because you can quantify things in the open market. I'll give you $10 for that. No, I want 15. I'll give you 12. How about 12.50? Yeah, that's sort of open market negotiation, which doesn't take place face to face, but through supply and demand. That dollars or some sort of currency then places a value on it. So it's about what you're willing to give up to get it, rather than what it does for you. Now that may seem like a very small thing, but in fact it's not. So when you look at the social value of labor and its representation by money, this is his second point, that the materiality of the social relationship, right, is represented by gold and silver, but that gets transformed into this fiat, this paper, right, and then that into the social relationship, the dynamic. So this idea that there's some sort of intervening, structure and mechanism here, which is money, that means that you don't necessarily concern yourself with the use value, that you get from it, but rather what it will go for in the open market, sort of what that exchange is.